We often kind of think about compartmentalisation as like it's important, so we need to have boundaries to our thinking. If that's just kind of invade every moment. The problem with that kind of, I like to think about like a beach ball analogy. Sometimes when we compartmentalise, the problem is that we kind of are just pushing it kind of down, and then the thoughts kind of pop back up. One of the most unhelpful things, like anything, when people say kind of don't worry or relax or you shouldn't feel guilty. I mean, I guess we need to acknowledge that it is an emotion that's going to show up.
Hi, I'm Lisa Caterina, the Partnership and Community Manager at Inherited Cancers Australia. Thank you for watching this Q&A with clinical psychologist Rebecca Van Lloy. There's often a pressure on women to stay strong for their families and even take the lead in organising appointments or managing risk. How can this expectation make it harder to deal with the what ifs?
Thanks, Lisa. That's obviously a really complex and layered question, and one that I've supported so many people navigating through. I guess either the scenario of at the same time of dealing with their own cancer diagnosis, making decisions for themselves, and then the timing at which this may happen, and no less in a situation where a family is exploring a risk within the family, and so many different ways that plays out for people, whether they're patient zero, as often is referred to, the first family, whether that's coming at the same time as a diagnosis. I think it's layered with role expectations, and I think I guess not to be too broad, but women generally have that expectation of caregiving, and that can be really difficult when you're trying to attend to your own needs and think about complex decision making, often for women where they're making decisions about surgery and treatments and what's happening kind of with their body, and at the same time trying to support and care for other family members. And so I think it's a difficult one, just even being mindful and reflecting on an individual experience and just stopping and taking a step back and considering that role. What's expected of you? Is it just something that by default you're kind of stepped into that kind of position because naturally to kind of care and soothe and reassure, and that tendency, I guess it's very hard when there are so many people affected by a situation, because I think it's very difficult, particularly for women, to attend to their needs, and when that need is then sitting behind the needs and comfort of so many. So I think I guess what I would sort of say is that certainly makes the what if layers harder, because I think naturally then you might be thinking for 5, 6, 7, 10 people, and that tendency for women to kind of place themselves then behind all of those other needs. And so I think the challenge of that is sometimes those what ifs can present themselves a little bit more in those quieter moments, or when the day's just been filled with meeting the needs for other people, that it can kind of be more invading and more intrusive, because you're not actually getting to stop and kind of reflect and think about what your experience is, and so it can sort of add to that more intrusive element and make it harder to deal with the what ifs, because there's no kind of time, and then generally the time that you're trying to look at that might be when you're exhausted, or at a time of the day where perhaps that's not necessarily a helpful way to be kind of exploring and making sense of the what ifs and your own fears and concerns and anxiety.
Yeah, great. Some people say they try to compartmentalise their worry only to find it rushes back at unexpected times. Is this a common coping strategy, and why might it work for some people but for others feel extremely overwhelming?
That's another really great question. I think, Lisa, it's tricky because we often kind of think about compartmentalisation as like it's important, so we need to have boundaries to our thinking. If that's what's just kind of invade every moment, standing under the shower, when we're trying to drive from point A to point B, that can really take away from not only having a lot of stress and anxiety invading kind of moments, but it can really take away from the quality of our experiences and memory making, and just the quality of our everyday life. And yet the problem with that kind of, I like to think about like a beach ball analogy. Sometimes when we compartmentalise, the problem is that we kind of are just pushing it kind of down, and then the thoughts kind of pop back up at us. And usually they'll find, you know, when you're trying to go to sleep or fall asleep, or and the problem with that mechanism is that people find it difficult to relax, to have quiet time when you try to talk to them about strategies, which we'll talk about later, for ways or practical tools. It becomes a bit of a problem because it will feel overwhelming because you've kind of kept it down. So when you do actually visit it, the kind of quality of it can be really overwhelming. And so I guess it's tricky. It's kind of about finding the middle ground in having some strategies that, you know, in this moment, and I'll talk about the stop technique a little bit later on, but, you know, where if in this moment it's invading, how do we sort of ground and recognize what's trying to kind of intrude and bring itself forward, and how do we, you know, how do we anchor ourselves so that we can stay really anchored in the present moment, and, you know, where do we actually make space to attend to the worry. So I guess what I would say is that we also need some strategies for dealing with the thoughts, and sometimes that's uncomfortable because it means finding methods and ways of actually examining the worry. Otherwise it just stays as this kind of, you know, thoughts that just keep kind of rushing past us, or it stays a sensation. So we kind of need to also find some ways of dealing with those thoughts and try to work out, like, what are some of those really specific things that I'm experiencing worry around, and do that in a, I guess, in a more structured, I guess we talk about structured worry and how we deal with worry in a very structured way, versus times where it may not be the kind of right place and time, and then how do we use kind of grounding techniques, so that we're kind of either grounding or attending to the worry rather than just that kind of, you know, mechanism of kind of shoving it down or kind of pushing it down in that sense.
Yeah, I love that, attending to the worry. Yeah. People sometimes avoid talking to family about their deepest worries, either to protect themselves or because they don't have the words to use. How might someone gently open up these conversations without feeling like a burden on their loved ones?
Some really great questions coming through here, Lisa, and just having that, one of the privileges, I guess, of walking alongside people, you know, that are dealing with an inherited cancer or dealing with that risk is, I think, the kind of the quality. It's a tricky thing because there's this kind of shared quality, as I was saying before, where there's this shared experience, and yet some of the things that, yeah, most of the things that people are going through are also quite deeply personal. They're shaped by individual values and preferences, and so I think sometimes it's not just about kind of being a burden, but it's also navigating that unknown about, you know, what I think and feel, and my values and preferences could influence, you know, how another person might be trying to approach the same, you know, levels of decision making. And certainly I see in families where, you know, people can have very different ideas or ways of approaching both cancer and cancer treatment, or managing that, you know, genetic or inherited risk. And so I think that, you know, the important parts, you know, are, you know, and also not wanting to put worries, you know, into people's minds about things that if they're a bit further along in their thinking, that they can feel like, I don't, you know, recognize that maybe other family members aren't at the same stage of thinking or decision making. And so I guess what I would say is that it is about trying to still think about what you need or what you hope for in that conversation, and acknowledging that the experience or the timing might be different for them. So look, I'm really kind of carrying this, and I do feel like I need to be able to talk about this with you, but I'm, you know, I'm worried that, you know, you might be at a different stage of your thinking, or I'm mindful that you've made a couple of, you know, comments, and maybe our thinking isn't really on the same page about this, but I'm feeling quite alone, and I need to be able to kind of talk about some of my concerns or some of the things that are weighing on me at the moment. I think it's really hard. We often don't like to put ourselves in the equation, and what we do is we kind of consider how it's going to impact everybody else, and then it shuts us down, and we think, you know, like we said, we want to protect, or we want to protect ourselves, or we want to protect the people that we love. And so I think, you know, that good technique about kind of saying, you know, I really kind of need to share this, but I'm mindful about, you know, these sorts of things. How can we sort of, you know, come together and just kind of have some room without perhaps, that premature reassurance or, advice giving, but just could we create some space to just talk about what I'm experiencing, knowing it might be different or knowing it might not be that. And in that invitation, it gives the other person the opportunity to be able to say, I'm kind of not ready for this conversation, or, how we can sort of respectfully approach that.
Yeah, or even acknowledge that they had no idea,
Absolutely.
the coming together. Yeah. A big topic that kind of exists in our community is the passing down of a gene mutation or a pathogenic variant. What would you say to someone who feels guilty about passing down the gene risk, not being able to shield their family from this, this what if?
Yeah. I think one of the most unhelpful things, like anything, when people say kind of don't worry or relax or you shouldn't feel guilty. I mean, I guess we need to acknowledge that, it is an emotion that's going to show up. And I think, like I said, one of the most unhelpful things would actually be is to kind of, okay, how do we kind of make space for that? And we can acknowledge that, exploring, I guess, to the extent, what does that guilt actually kind of mean, though, for the individual? I think for me, like, guilt is part of kind of an emotion, but trying to help the person understand what might guilt be inhibiting. Like, is guilt kind of meaning that you're compensating in some kind of way, and maybe, like you say, taking on a role where you're denying yourself of your own emotions and care and support in terms of what you need. Are you making it so much about the comfort of others that you're not actually attending to yourself, and you're kind of not at all wanting to kind of, it's not about me, or dealing with that. I think guilt is a really hard emotion, particularly if it's starting to be really disruptive, and we'll talk about kind of different layers of support. I think an element of that we can, I guess, acknowledge or meet that with some compassion, of sort of acknowledging that I understand why I kind of feel this way, but it's kind of what I do with the guilt and how I carry. Can I bring some compassion to the guilt? Can I kind of soften it a little bit? Can I hold it in a little bit more gently, as opposed to how do we sort of, try to take the guilt away? And I think that isolates people, because they feel like they're going to be told you shouldn't feel guilty, rather than, some qualities about, how to soften it. And it may just be kind of, how do I expand my breathing when the feeling of guilt comes up? How do I make sure I'm not in my behavior kind of denying myself something or overcompensating? And so if guilt is something that you're really struggling with, it is, about how to kind of, approach guilt, with compassion and attend to it. It's probably hopefully there's something that makes sense in that, and that's not too gentle in.
It definitely does. Yeah. Now, many people say that the what if hits hardest in sudden bursts, in the waiting room, lying awake at night, when symptoms spark worry. What quick grounding strategies can help steady the body and mind in those moments?
Yeah. Really important. And I think it kind of ties to what we were saying before. I think there's two parts to that kind of really intrusive part. Sometimes if we're really constantly, if that's the only mechanism that we've got is to kind of push things down, and we're not really attending to the what if or the worry, it kind of stays as this sensation that we're constantly sort of, it rises up in the body. And the reality is that we need to acknowledge that the reason that sensation keeps coming up is that, cancer in any form is a threat. And, it is on every level, psychologically, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And it's one of those, experiences in life that just invades every aspect of life, past, present, and future. And so I think that it's important to kind of, rather than just see the what ifs as a threat, try to tune in to kind of what is feeling the most threatening at the moment. What's the loudest part of the kind of what if? The what if may be, right now, just the immediate result, and it's very acute, and the what if is in the present. And part of when we talk about anchoring, and when we talk about grounding strategies, I think the thing I'd like to say to people about that is it's not it's not an answer. It's not a relaxation strategy for the waiting room. It's actually about that threat signal that is basically kind of saying, I'm not safe. I'm not sure what's actually happening, that the physiological reaction of your nervous system saying, I'm not safe right now. And when we engage, that unfortunately, like what we're so good at is with normal threats, we can get into that problem solving or do something about it or remove the threat or control the threat. And, when we're living with, an inherited risk or we're dealing with cancer, we don't have those same mechanisms. And so that can just leave your body in this kind of, state of threat all the time. So when we actually talk about those kind of grounding techniques, and so we can talk about things like, you've got some great resources now on your website, Lisa, that you're developing for people, those very brief exercises that are about reminding our nervous system that in this moment, I don't know what's going to happen, tomorrow when my results are communicated, or the next day, or the future, but how do I bring about a quality of safety just to this moment, to this next breath that I have? And so strategies like engaging the practice breathing, like box breathing, or focusing on listening to some music while you're waiting, these actually engage our soothing system and parts of our nervous system that help anchor us. And so what we sort of want to do is that sometimes if we're practicing these kind of strategies like throughout the day, even when we're not particularly in a threat state, it can make it a bit easier to bring those things in place when we're getting that really big sense of overwhelm. So what I say to people is, don't wait until kind of you're in the state of overwhelm. It can be really hard to sort of in that moment go, what am I supposed to do? Trying to kind of have these as things in our toolkit, kind of, toolkit ready. So, bringing in a practice daily of, some box breathing for just 2 to 3 rounds, or, practicing some short practices, and there's a list of those techniques I think that you have available, is a way of just being tuned into how do we actually engage that part of our nervous system.
Rebecca, earlier you mentioned the stop technique. I'd love for you to explore and explain a little bit more about that for us.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. It's one of those techniques that we can use, like you were talking about, like in the waiting room, or, when anxiety is kind of rising up and becoming overwhelming. And so it's kind of the basic, like stop, meaning like, S-T-O-P. And so basically the S is stop. Sometimes when we have anxiety, we want to rush, we want to push, we want to keep kind of going. And so, if you're about to kind of, go off to an appointment and you're waiting for a scan and you're feeling the lump in your throat and you're feeling flushed and you're rushing out of the car, just stop. Just stop for a moment before you kind of proceed and kind of get out of the car. So that's S, stop. T is take a breath. And again, often, when we get into the stress response, we don't kind of slow things down. So as we were explaining before, breath is the best way of engaging our nervous system into that parasympathetic response. And when we say take a breath, if we could do just 1 full minute of just kind of slowing down and just catching our breath, we get into that shallow breathing and we hold our breath. So just to take that breath and take a 1 full minute if we can, or take 30 seconds of just actually taking a breath. We kind of want to observe, and I always say observe in 2 ways. First, observe what's going on the inside. I'm having racing thoughts, my chest is tight, I feel hot, I feel flushed. Just take a moment, my thoughts are kind of very worried. So observe what's going on the inside of us and try and bring a bit of softness to just, okay, I'm feeling very panicked, I'm feeling really overwhelmed. And then observe what's going on around you and your surroundings. So we think about our senses, what can I hear? What can I see? What can I smell? What's going on in our senses? Oh, we did smell. I've lost taste. That might be a trickier one. And so thinking about kind of that, being aware of our surroundings and just observing what's kind of going on immediately around us. And then we want to think about kind of just then thinking about proceeding. But when we kind of feel ready to do so, and we can do these steps quite quickly, we can do them in less than 2 minutes. But just then thinking about kind of how do we then think about proceeding and what's the next thing that we're going to kind of be doing, connecting to my values. I'm really scared about this test result, but I'm really proud of myself that I'm approaching this and I'm not avoiding it, and I'm doing something for myself and my family. And so sometimes with proceeding, if we make that values-based statement about what we're doing and why, and reminding ourselves of kind of the intention, I know that this test brings uncertainty, but I also realize that this test is going to help me kind of make decisions, and it's here to kind of support me and my family and what I can do to look after my health value. So thinking about when we proceed, how can we kind of join it back up to kind of something meaningful? Or proceed might be, I'm standing under the shower and I need to kind of take care of myself, and how can I proceed in that in that direction of taking care of myself at this difficult time and connecting it to that kind of value. So that stop technique, stop, take a breath, observe what's going on the inside, and then connecting to the outside, and then thinking about how do we proceed in a way that connects meaningfully to our values and what it is we're trying to do in this moment, or bring to the moment.
And then I guess the next step is when the what if feels constant. So we kind of talk about that relaxed state, but when it's constant, they're affecting your sleep, your focus, relationships. What evidence-based approaches would psychologists use to help?
Yeah, it's important. So 2 parts. So exactly as you're saying, Lisa, like sometimes absolutely when worry can kind of get it like we are in a rip. And I think if we think about when we ask for help, worry can be incredibly exhausting and kind of get to a point where, like I said, if that kind of, it's like getting caught in a rip and being taken kind of out. And then we start to get exhausted. It affects our mood, our sleep, and we can't sort of really anchor and steady ourselves. And so, absolutely asking for help at those points can be important. And what psychologists kind of bring to that is that most individuals, we have lots of strategies for coping, like I was saying before. Like we know how to problem solve and plan, and we can normally get ourselves out of stressful situations or problems. But cancer and dealing with an inherited risk, they're not problems to be solved. There is no, often there is, there's certain steps that we can take, but there's still the kind of that big quality of uncertainty. And so psychologists can help kind of bring in how do we actually engage the soothing system if we're always in that kind of threat drive kind of way of kind of responding to situations. Most of us can do that quite well, except when that becomes sustained and prolonged. And what we know is that even if we take actions when we're dealing with an inherited risk, that threat is lifelong. That threat is through every new piece of information, or finding out about other family members affected and those sorts of things. And so we often don't have those tools. We're not taught those tools. They're not, I think what I'd like to say to people, they don't come intuitively or naturally. And when people get to a point where they've exhausted their normal mechanisms for problem solving and coping and dealing with stress, we're able to use different techniques in helping people build that kind of soothing system, and that can open people up to trying to help people with techniques that deal with trauma-informed practices, and managing how do you deal with kind of the thoughts, particularly when the thoughts, they're not just worried based, they're things that may actually be a reality, and there's some different techniques in doing that. And I think that the kind of key part of that is, when you talk to a psychologist that is very familiar with supporting people, affected by cancer or people living with an inherited risk, you don't have to explain, you don't want to have to go into a situation where, this isn't just about like everyday worry, like, what if I don't get a promotion, or, what if my kid doesn't get into the school, that I've always wanted them to, or, what if I don't, ... These are very deeply held, complex kind of ways that we're trying to kind of work through uncertainty. And so I think psychologists have sometimes some extra tools in how to help people develop strategies for that.
Mm. And how can someone tell when it's time to move beyond self-help strategies and seek a more structured sense of support, like seeking out GP for a mental health plan?
Yeah, I think I'd add, it's so difficult depending. Often people are attending so many appointments. There's, the financial toxicity of all of this. And, so again, it becomes another layer, right? I should be able to cope. There may be a cost associated with that care. I would really encourage people, where you may be kind of linked to a treatment, centre where you can access services through the hospital base, where there's free services. Often people will say, there's that threshold of where I don't think I kind of need it. And so I would say, if you've got the resources, accessing them early can give you that toolkit where you say, I may not need this now, but I recognize I'm in this, like we say, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so, any valuable bits of information that I can recognize this is a different life event and I might need some support. I think to what you were saying, particularly where, anxiety is, invading, waking up with that knot in your stomach, feeling like, I think we think traditionally about it. It's not about just the doona dive and not going to work or not being able to perform, but really checking in with yourself when you feel like you're masking, you're putting on a brave face, you're having thoughts like, my loved ones have no idea how I'm actually feeling, feeling really kind of helpless, hopeless, alone. And a lot of the people that I have conversations with, will say, I just don't feel like I can have these conversations, with other people, and they're things that are just kind of constantly getting that interference in their thoughts and feelings. So really where it is either, yes, interfering with things like sleep and mood and your ability to kind of connect, but also when you're starting to kind of feel like a sense of isolation and that, you're really managing and trying to navigate things, on your own, and it's feeling too much. But I know that there can be those barriers of, I don't want to take things away from my family or cost or those sorts of things that can sometimes just add to the perceived burden of asking for help for yourself, or I should be strong, or I should be able to work through this, just to really understand that it represents a very different type of psychology, and, one that most of us are not naturally equipped to kind of navigate through, even with the best stress management and coping mechanisms. Yeah.
It's great advice. Many people feel like they should be able to cope on their own. How do you reassure someone that seeking these tools or professional support at any level is not a sign of weakness, but it's a sign of strength?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously to reiterate, I've sort of jumped ahead to that answer. I think I can't sort of emphasize enough, that often people, when they have these conversations, they'll say, but I've dealt with so many stressful life events and so many stressful situations. And what I try and explain to people is that cancer is actually a trauma. And that word initially kind of, a lot of people sort of have a bit of a strong reaction to that. When we actually kind of look at what that means, we tend to think about trauma as, just external events, or when we think about someone who's had an accident or a physical assault or those sorts of things. But trauma is also, any sense of kind of destabilization of our sense of self, our identity, our sense of future, but the inherent core parts of safety. And, having an inherited cancer or living with that risk reorganizes, our identity, our future, everything that we know. It rewrites, it rewrites our lives. And we have to understand that profound reorganization of self is something that is overwhelming to kind of navigate. And then if you add, like, normally our first kind of like level of coping is to reach out to others. And if that network of others, if where you normally get your soothing and your reassurance is are people who are navigating the exact same fears and questions and concerns, asking for help isn't about weakness. It's about acknowledging the aloneness. It's about acknowledging there's qualities about what I'm facing which are extraordinary and are stretching beyond my normal coping. And I guess that's just that really important thing for people to recognize, is that it often requires, like, the what ifs are different for everyone, but we can sort of help people, I guess psychologists that work in this area, trying to work out where are you getting kind of caught in the what if. Like, is it the future that is just bringing this kind of overwhelming, kind of sense of doom? Is it actually the more complex layered family relationships and dynamics that feel changed, that you're not sure how to kind of navigate? And I guess we have some of that level of experience to kind of work out, either at the individual level or at the connection level. Sometimes it's an information gap, sometimes it's helping people kind of recognize that a lot of the fear of the what if is that they're using a limited information source, or they're too afraid to explore information that might be able to reduce some of their fears and concerns. And so sometimes we can just help people navigate this, if it's too scary to face those what ifs and to attend to the what if questions alone, we're there to support people in, understanding what's sitting underneath the what if, and how do we look into that and make that, approach that in a way that at your own pace, or to work out what you might need to help you kind of hold those what ifs.
Yeah, great answer. So you've briefly talked about some of the resources we have, but what kind of support is available, both through ICA and more broadly, for someone who feels weighed down by the what ifs?
Absolutely. I think one of the challenges with anxiety, I would really say, is to use really targeted resources. I think, this is why I'm so thrilled to be partnering with you and having these conversations, because I think when we look at generic information about anxiety, a lot of people find it hard to kind of engage with that. So what you're doing is just remarkable, to give people where they can really hear their voice of anxiety. And the voice of anxiety is, I think, is very unique, shared and unique, but to your community. And so finding those kind of tailored resources that you offer, but also things like, the Cancer Council. Peter Mac has some great resources. One in particular I'd really like to highlight is that kind of first level, I think, starting off, shared experiences. And again, you do that beautifully, people talking about their stories, where we can kind of find your voice or your experience maybe in there, and so we can feel less alone through that validation in hearing other people's stories and experiences. Through Peter Mac, they have a tool called My Cancer Plan, and I guess that can be that first step if you're at kind of levels of kind of education that's got very specific information about cancer-related anxiety and how we navigate or think about that. So you might find that first level of thinking about mindfulness, different kinds of techniques, understanding about fear of cancer recurrence or fear of cancer. They have some really specific tools to talk about that. There are, I guess, culturally specific resources that can be available through 13 Yarn. And so really starting, I think, with quite cancer specific, resources. I guess if it's taking that next step, and sorry, Lisa, if I'm sort of jumping ahead, I think then, those resources can help navigate people to again, psychologists through their GP that have a particular interest and focus, in working with people affected by cancer. And that's usually an important starting point, which we'll expand on.
Yeah, I also kind of want to add, we have a library of resources. So what we find is, we have people coming to us looking for, downloading our questions to ask their genetic counsellor. So they kind of download it, they'll talk to their family about it before their appointment. It kind of lessens the anxiety. They kind of have a better idea of what that appointment is going to look like. So they go into that meeting a little bit more prepared. So there's downloadable resources. We've got the online groups, which it's kind of a wealth of shared experience or peer experience, and you kind of can't. It's so invaluable. So yeah.
to that, Lisa, I think, like, I know it's really overwhelming. There's information overload and there's just so many things. And, add to that, social media catches onto a feed and you're sort of getting bombarded with messages. But I think it's really helpful, to kind of really try and identify the voice of the what if, like, what is it that I'm where am I kind of really struggling? And even though people will say sometimes I'm scared to read things, I don't want to read something, that might be distressing or might put things into my mind that I'm not thinking about, but it can really help you be more tuned in to kind of really, like, what is it? I mean, it's an enormous kind of situation and there are so many aspects to it, but what is the part that I'm kind of really struggling with? And as you say, when we read these sorts of resources, we can go, yeah, it's kind of, these are questions that I need answered, or so by using the resources that are there, I think it can help kind of shape, like, what is this kind of really big overwhelming feeling that's sometimes hard to put into words, as you said before, to starting to kind of break it down to, like, I'm afraid of this, or I don't think I understand this part, or I'm worried about, like, I feel like I understand things now, but my kids are little, and and what's going to happen, when they reach certain milestones, or how do you talk about these things? And sometimes it's knowing when to pause things too, that says, okay, don't have to answer all the what ifs now, but I know actually what I know in answering that question is, I could talk to a psychologist at any time, or I could come back to the genetic counsellor. This is a conversation I can have, in time, particularly in this space. It's more than one decision. It's more than one conversation. These are lifetime conversations. These are lifetime kinds of questions that change shape over time. And so I think just, interacting with, information over time can help sort of say, okay, I don't know the answer to that, but I know where to find it. And, I know that I can come back to this resource, when I'm actually at that stage as well, not feeling that you've got to address all of those what ifs, all at once.
At one time. Yes, that's so true. Now, if you could leave our community with one reassuring reminder about living with these thoughts, what would it be?
Absolutely. That's one.
Big question.
That's a tricky one for me. I think it is really important to still underscore, whilst it's important for people to to not feel alone. We do actually recognise that every experience is unique. And one of the things we were talking about, Lisa, is the way that we talk about Inherited Cancers Australia talks about, like, there's no one path we walk, and it does a beautiful job of trying to really, include, all people's experiences, that you're not left feeling unseen or lost, and that there is a kind of a place for you and what you're actually experiencing. And I think to also know that to take your time in terms of how things unfold, and know that you're not alone at any kind of stage of this part of it. It might be, there's a lot of information available now that that wasn't available in a community that that wasn't previously there for those people. So really just feeling that there is a place in terms of living with these thoughts, that that you are not alone, and yet there is a space where your individual experience will also kind of be seen and heard. And I really love the way that is opening up as a space for everyone's experience.
Thank you, Rebecca. Rebecca, I just want to really thank you for your time, expertise, and guidance, with this project. And we've kind of discussed the resources that we have. People want to head to the website. All of the resources of the external links you mentioned are on our website. But yeah, I just really want to thank you for your time, and I hope that this reaches the right people and is able to help and connect with people that really need this support.
Thank you, Lisa. There's one more thing I was just going to add.
Yes,
I'm so sorry. And
no, at all.
Yeah. I was just going to say, when you are, if somebody is reaching that point of trying to look for a psychologist, I think some of the keywords that can be really helpful, that there is, I didn't mention before, the Australian Psychological Society, and you can obviously have a link through there to a specific category around cancer or genetics, and so it can help identify a psychologist. I guess psychologists who typically work in this area we have a funny name. It doesn't do us much justice, but it's called psycho-oncology. So even Googling things like psychologists in cancer or psycho-oncology in your major centre can be a way of I would really encourage that as a starting point, just because of that layered complexity that when people come to ask for help, not all psychologists will necessarily understand, the levels around kind of cancer or dealing with an inherited risk. And it's really important that I don't want people to experience those barriers in finding the right care at the right time. So I guess I would add that quality in there as well, that we recognise that's another really important part. And there are psychologists out there that can understand your experience and support you through with those steps, and obviously working with your GP. If you're in a rural or remote area, often looking for psychologists in oncology in the major cities. Most of them nowadays will do telehealth and those sorts of practices. So even if you can't find something locally, really look more broadly, and you'll often find those individuals will provide services to people in more remote situations as well. But I guess adding to that, just a reminder that there are people that are there to kind of support you on all of those levels. So
thank you. No, that's great advice. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you so much.
Thank you.